Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the Green Book Pod, produced in association with Lib Dem Pod. Our aim in this series is to explore the major challenges facing the country and to discuss what the Liberal Democrat response should be. We're featuring both external experts and party insiders. My name is Duncan Brack. 10 years ago, I was part of the team that wrote the Green Book, New Directions for Liberals in Government. We aim to contribute to the debate about the challenges facing the next Parliament and the need for innovative green solutions that the Liberal Democrats adopt. 10 years later, the political context is obviously very different, but our belief remains that there is a massive opportunity for the Liberal Democrats to set out an agenda for making a real difference, but only by identifying innovative, radical, and robust solutions with realistic strategies to deliver them. So that's the aim behind this podcast series. Last year, we looked at economic policy, the challenges of reaching net zero, and the relationship between the EU and the UK. And in this new episode, we're discussing the question of artificial intelligence and its relation to politics. So I'll hand over now to my colleague, Robin Stafford.
Thank you, Duncan, and hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast on the subject of AI, artificial intelligence. This has had increasing amounts of publicity in recent years with really quite polarized views. On the one hand, it's seen as offering huge potential to transform business and other organizations, reducing costs and creating entirely new capabilities. But on the downside, we hear of threats to democracy with a surge in fake videos and information, the potential for mass job losses as AI systems replace employees, and at the extreme end, dire tales of AI systems taking over humanity altogether. Then there's the concern over the concentration of AI power in too few powerful hands and governments struggling to regulate them. So what is the hype and what's the reality? How do we build public trust and make it explainable? And the aim of today's podcast is to provide a more balanced view and to give you a sense of what you need to know and maybe perhaps what you do not and do not need to be concerned about. That includes what you might want to be looking for, both from governments and business, and how we balance the need for regulation with desirable innovation. We're pleased today to have three guests who can provide that full range of perspectives, from the technical innovation aspects through to its impact and the challenge of regulation. Chairing the session is Tim Clement-Jones. Tim sits in the House of Lords, where he's the Lib Dem spokesperson for Science, Innovation and Technology, and was the former chair of the Lords Select Committee on AI, as well as being on other related committees. Outside of Westminster, he's a founding member of the OECD's group on AI and is a consultant on AI and policy and regulation. So Tim brings a deep understanding of the challenges and its impact and regulation. Leonie Muick is the VP of Products at Enplan, who are a London-based scale-up using AI to help with construction project management. But before Enplan, she was Chief Product Officer at a quantum computing startup and is a speaker and mentor on deep tech product management of the UK's National Computing Centre, as well as assessing Innovate UK projects. And finally, Leo Ringer founded and runs Form Ventures, who are a venture capital fund investing in early stage tech companies with a focus on tightly regulated markets like fintech and healthcare. He spent the first part of his career working on business and economic policy, including as an advisor to the UK Business Secretary. Leo emphasised the need for policymakers, entrepreneurs and investors to spend more time talking to and understanding one another. With our guest today, we've certainly got all of that ground covered. With that introduction, I'll hand over to Tim to chair today's session. Tim.
Thank you very much indeed, Robin. I'm going to kick off really with a very broad question to each of Leonie and Leo, because I do think that it's often the very first question that people really want an answer to, and sometimes it proves a bit difficult for respondents to actually answer. So, it's not as easy as it may seem. And it's really, what do we mean by AI in non-technical terms? It's all very well to talk about deep neural networks or whatever, but what are its main components? What's the sort of data and the content that's needed to train AI? What do those terms mean, really? And you like to just give some examples of AI in practice, current and future? Now, I think what we really need to do perhaps is draw at this stage a distinction between what you might regard as beneficial and non-beneficial forms of AI, just to sort of get our polarization going, if you like, which Robin mentioned. I'll start with you, Leonie, and welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, what do we mean by AI? A lot, but typically what we mean today is forms of machine learning, very, very like sophisticated forms. And perhaps it's the best to look at how humans learn and then what the equivalent is of what machines learn to understand what we really mean. So how do humans learn? Well, we get a lot of inputs from the environment. We get books, conversations, experiences, things that we sense. And we at some point start recognizing some patterns. We're extremely good at that, right? From early childhood, we can tell a dog from a cat, although, you know, on the face of it, they seem quite similar. And we also learn more complicated things like men and women. We can distinguish them very, very early, like social constructs, right? And then we learn how to put sentences together, and all of this comes from the input and the data that we build. So in machine learning terms, so what the machine does, the equivalent of this is they build a model from a lot of training data that I feed into the computer, and then the computer can infer information about a new example it hasn't seen before, so that the computer then also learns to distinguish between dogs and cats, right? So that's roughly what we talk about. We talk about the data. We talk about a specific recipe about how to train a model on that data. And then we talk about the inference I can make based on this model. Those are the general terms I think we probably should introduce. And then we can do wonderful things with this, right? We can, for example, train a model to recognize pneumonia from X-ray images. And it's extremely good at that. It can say, oh, this is pneumonia, this is not pneumonia. And there's been great studies on this showing that clinicians aided by these sorts of deep learning techniques that are used there make better diagnoses, right? So that's an example of how this works in practice and how we can actually do something to help with these models today.
That's really interesting, Leonie. Before I come to Leo, I just want to ask you, because quite often people say, look, that was all very well, you know, you're talking about pattern recognition, prediction, and so on. That was all, you know, this kind of machine learning, this was all what we got used to in the past. But generative AI is something different. Doesn't that have a different way of working and so on? And what's your response when somebody comes up with saying, well, I think these large language models, they're a completely new dimension? Do you think that's the case or not?
I do think that's the case, yes. So I think if we're talking about like the newest developments, like deep learning, that was one of the big developments, right, in the last 10 years, and making these things like, you know, diagnosing pneumonia from X-rays possible. But now we're seeing these large language models emerging, and well, they're also good at something very specific, namely saying what the next word in a sentence will be. They have so many parameters, though, and they're so complex, these models, that they have what's called emergent properties. So they can do things that they weren't trained on explicitly. So they have these uncanny abilities to do other things. And we have started giving them access to tools, right? So they can actually become what's called agents, and they can like pursue this goal with these tools that they're given. So these are sort of the first glimpses that we have of what perhaps general artificial intelligence might look like. Although we are by no means there, and these developments are obviously happening at lightning speed. so fast, so quickly, so active, and really exciting for me personally to be part of at least a little bit. And therefore, for these generative AI models, they are a completely new quality. Yeah. If I compare them to what was there from deep learning, like deep learning was regular normal neural nets. They were very good at one specific task, and we could train them on one very specific task, and they became really good at it. And now these large language models, they seem to be, well, at least mediocre at a lot of different things, and that's a new quality that we're seeing.
That's really, we'll come on to that when we start talking about the risks and the points you made about versatility and autonomy and so on. We'll come back to that. Leo, do you generally chime in with that description, or do you have a different take? Because in a sense, you come from a slightly different angle, don't you? You're not a developer like Leonie. You're looking across the landscape of different sorts of AI that you invest in, basically. How somebody asks you, what are you investing in, Leo? Well, how do you describe what you're doing?
Well, I'm really glad I didn't have to go first just then in taking on the question of what is AI, because Leonie did a far better job than I would have done as someone who's closer to the coalface than I am. But in terms of what we do, the lens through which we see this is we're investing in very early stage tech companies. So typically maybe two founders with an idea of something they want to build, or a business that's kind of got an MVP, its early prototype together, is maybe found its first couple of customers for its approach. But increasingly, and I'd say almost predominantly now, those teams are coming to us, and AI is a part of what they're pitching, what they're raising capital to build out further. Both because it's just such an important part of the technological capability of any business now, I think, but also because those potentially more innovative early stage companies, they're building at the frontier of technology, and so AI is really that frontier at the moment. So it's a lot of what we see. There's definitely also a lot of hype, even in our world, about AI. Because
I was going to ask you, because there must be a lot of people who insert the phrase AI, and actually it's not represented by reality.
That's exactly right. And on one hand, obviously people are trying to raise money, they want to come across as interesting and buzzy, but just putting AI in doesn't mean there's AI there. And also, as Leonie indicated, there's a whole spectrum of sub technologies really and approaches that AI can refer to. And so, depending on the domain you're talking about, is it transport and we're talking about self-driving cars? Is it healthcare and we're talking about helping clinicians diagnose something? They're all part of, I guess, this family that you could describe as AI, but they're at the next level down, they're very different. And so again, from our perspective, it's saying, well, what's the use case really here for this? Why are you using AI? And again, sometimes actually it's interesting when you ask the question, maybe the technology or maybe the approach doesn't necessarily need AI, but it's what people have jumped to because it's sort of exciting and interesting. And so I think there's still a long way to go with software businesses that aren't AI companies, but are doing really interesting things. But at the moment, obviously, most of the focus and most of the hype is around an AI. And I suppose if I have a job, it's to try and discern between those teams that are building something that could turn into a really big business, and those that are building something that might still be really interesting and very credible and scientifically important, and but actually at the end of the day, doesn't for one of many reasons look like it could grow into a very large business, which is the kind of the focus of us in particular, as opposed to, I think, academic research and investment in AI, or even kind of the grant-based funding as well, that are there to support these technologies, but not necessarily with a view to their monetization specifically, which is kind of the world I live in.
Yes, I'm with you. But you've invested in new technology, I'm assuming, for quite a number of years. I mean, is there something about AI as a new technology which is different? I mean, Robin introduced us by talking about some of the hype. I mean, and you've obviously got to have quite a strong hype detector as part of what you do. Is the really substance, in a sense, in AI, if you can describe all the different use cases, if you like, that you've talked about. Is there something there that is different?
I think there is, and one of maybe it's best to kind of go to an example, because that's often the way I think about this in terms of particular. So I sit on the board of a company called Checkstep, which uses AI to help detect harmful content on online platforms. So that could be terrorist content, it could be all the horrible things that you don't really want on your platform. And for a couple of reasons, I think that's a job that's very well suited to AI. First of all, it's the kind of job that an AI can be trained to do, because you can sort of show it the things you don't like, it can learn, and it can try and weed those out. But also, the alternative is actually sitting humans down in front of a sequence of very unpleasant images and text and videos, and asking them to do it the same job. And there's all sorts of reasons why, even though perhaps from an accuracy perspective, the humans still sort of the best solution from a particularly difficult edge cases, and that human judgment is still hugely valuable. Actually, it's probably the kind of job that we don't want people doing if we can avoid it, from the perspective of the psychological harm that it can create for moderators. And there's lots of evidence that that's the case. So I think there are some really good examples of where, for lots of reasons, if AI can achieve it, and we haven't been able to achieve this really before, but we can now, then it seems like a great fit. And there are other cases where actually I think it's more controversial. We talked about clinicians and clinical judgment, and there are some people that argue, well, actually, you want a well-trained, experienced individual making the important calls, and of course, I don't think most of the companies we look at in the healthcare space would argue with that. They'd frame it much more as supplementing, that clinician's judgment with an extra technology. But I think in some cases, perhaps if the question is it really that thing? I think sometimes it maybe gets overweighted as the solution, when in fact it's part of a mix. It might be AI with human judgment in a certain context, and it's the mix that's where the value comes from, as opposed to it just being sort of, let's do AI everywhere all the time. That's always going to be the best.
Understood. And so, Leonie, back to you. And as Leo says, we can do this now, which is, we have changed the last few years, have enhanced the capabilities of these deep neural networks, machine learning, whatever description we have for it. Now, why do you think that is? Because we've had several AI winters since the term was invented back in 1956, haven't we?
That's right. Why is that? Well, we are like in the second wave almost of an AI spring right now, right? Due to these large language models coming online and being open for everyone to play with and tinker with and use. And the first wave of it was definitely deep learning and the community solving some technical problems with how to train those models and being able to train them properly. And then obviously also the increase in computing power being aided by more and more GPUs helped there really make that possible. Yeah, I do think that right now this generative AI wave of the AI spring has a quality that at least I haven't seen before, because it is pointing into this direction where really like the technology is there. It is relatively accessible. It's relatively easy to use. You don't have to have a computer science degree and a physics PhD to use this technology, and it's open, and it really just changes the pace with which you can build products and build things that may aid decision making, that may aid software development or writing, or so I do think that there's an acceleration coming that is a huge opportunity.
That's really interesting, because I'm going to come on to open access AI to add to your list of versatility and autonomy when we come to our risk discussion. But you're in a sense saying it's opened up as a tool this is, I mean, I would describe it as a retail use to a greater extent than ever before. It is not just something that a business procures. This is in the hands of us all, and in our smartphones and so on, increasingly in that sense.
That's right. And it's also, if businesses get their kind of data sorted out, right? It's so easy to put these layers of AI on top now that, like using all the data that you have to your advantage is becoming easier and easier. So these things are really opening up, and especially in the usability and the ease of use with which I can just get into it and use them and try them and tinker with them. That's really what's changing the landscape at the moment.
Let me ask you a more technical question, because some people say, well, look, it all depends on having access to big data sets and so on. Others are saying, well, actually, as you move towards more probabilistic type of training and machine learning, it may be that you don't need these massive data sets, that you won't need all the resource. Then again, other people are saying, well, once you get quantum computing in, then you're going to need even more resource. And I'm going to come to Leo when we talk about the money, so to speak. But from the technological point of view, where do you think we're heading?
That's a very good question. I mean, in terms of predictive AI, so I'm using the example that I used with the X-rays, right? That is a form of predictive AI. I have some data and I want to predict some new outcome. It's what we do at NPlan mostly as well. We have a bunch of scheduled data. We have a huge data set of construction schedules, and we can predict why and by how much a new construction project will be delayed. So for this predictive AI, there are all sorts of very cool new techniques that are very hard to understand, like Gaussian process learning, for example, that make it much easier to train a predictive model with less data. So that's definitely where we're heading in this predictive AI space. So in the generative AI space, there's also a funny thing happening. So we've trained these huge models. I mean, GPT-4 was trained on like the whole internet. It has, I don't know, 1 trillion parameters approximately. It cost $100 million to train. But now more and more people are developing techniques to train smaller models that are not generally as great as like GPT-4, but that are better at very specific tasks. So we're going the other way again, making it a bit more specific, making it a bit more specialized. And there, like, yes, this is definitely difficult for like a single business to do unless they're OpenAI or they have all of this infrastructure. But what has happened is that we can take these big models and we can do what's called fine-tuning them, or now a new technology called kind of grounding, a retrieval augmented generation comes up where we can use these huge models, but we can make them specific to our use case. And that's what we can do with relatively little data. So we can use the models. We obviously have to use OpenAI's models or Anthropic's model, someone else's model, but we can kind of tailor them to our needs. And that's what's happening, I think, in Gen AI at the moment. That's what's accelerating kind of the use of it in a specific business context.
That's really interesting, seen from the developer's point of view. How about from the investor's point of view, Leo? Are you seeing that trend in the marketplace? Where are you placing your bets? Do you think that the access of SMEs, for instance, does provide exciting opportunities, or should we all just buy shares in Microsoft?
Well, I'm definitely going to try and avoid giving any investment advice on a podcast or just generally at any time. But I think I absolutely recognise the pattern that you were just both describing of sort of this opening up, because I think we saw it in startups in a couple of ways. The first one being that 20, 30 years ago, if you wanted to start a technology company, you'd have to buy a bunch of servers. It was very capital intensive, operationally intensive, energy intensive. And actually now, and this, I'll come back to AI specifically, but now really, because of the advent of cloud computing in particular, you can achieve very impressive levels of software development, both iteration and performance, with a couple of people in a couple of sort of retail laptops, essentially, because the underlying infrastructure over the last 20 years has been built. The platform on which every single startup really that we would invest in or might invest in is building on that kind of usually that cloud infrastructure. And so the costs to getting going have come right down. And so what you've seen commensurately is a whole load. If you think of an early stage technology company as a kind of experiment, really, can we build this thing? And if we build it, will people buy it? And will it be useful? We have many more experiments being run because of the costs are lower. And that I think overall is a really good thing. Potentially makes my job a bit harder picking between them. But I think that's a good problem to have. And I think the same thing is happening in AI, and Leonie was just describing it there with, in particularly generative AI. This is a thing that people will be familiar with. You can get something to give some text back or some answers, do your homework for you, whatever it might be. Because these big players like OpenAI have spent a lot of money and a lot of time building these models, that's actually work that most startups aren't now attempting to do themselves. They say, well, that infrastructure has been built, we're going to build on top of it, just like we built on top of cloud. And actually cloud and kind of LLMs, these models, there's some analogies there. And I think there were a couple of implications from that, one of which is it's great because you can have this explosion in people building these interesting niche focused use cases off this kind of fairly general platform. And so lots more experiments, lots more ideas, innovation happening quicker, clinical solutions, transport solutions. It's good for society and outcomes in general, I think, that these experiments can get run. The one implication from a business perspective is, has all the value now gone to those who put in all the time and effort in building those application layers, just like we've seen an absolutely enormous amount of value go to those cloud providers like AWS, Amazon, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud. And so on one angle, it looks like an explosion of innovation. On the other angle, it looks like potentially a huge capture of value by some very well-resourced incumbents. And you mentioned about chips and the other player here, NVIDIA, who make the chips, a lot of them that are powering this revolution at a silicon level. They've also captured a lot of value. So, I mean, we'll come back, I think, to kind of some of those dynamics. But yes, a great opening up, but also in some respects, maybe a great concentration sort of happening at the same time, which is a little bit paradoxical.
I would agree. Sorry, I would agree with this, and this, especially in a Gen AI world where you need a lot of data, right? Incumbents have a huge advantage. They have all the data, right? So like for a new startup without that sort of cloud, without that sort of database, to get in there is very difficult.
That's really helpful. We're going to come on to competition policy before too long. But that is, I think, it's very important that we actually understand what the landscape looks like and don't get overly optimistic about it opening up to sunlit uplands and open access and so on. But let me come back to you again, Leo, in terms of talking about what the positives and the opportunities are in terms of particularly business opportunities that you see, but also I think really the UK as a location for AI development, and what you think, if you like, the landscape is like for AI developers here.
So overall, I think it's incredibly positive, and the UK has been quick to. Well, we have a strong venture and startup ecosystem as an enabling layer. We also have incredible talent. And so we have those with capital like myself willing to find brilliant talent and invest. And that is a foundational layer that's existed for quite a long time now in the UK. And I think AI is sort of the next iteration of that. And as long as those two things are there, they're two of the main ingredients, I think, for the business opportunities we'll see. I think the third main ingredient, which we've talked about much less, is on the regulation and the regulatory response. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. But the business opportunities are absolutely there. Obviously, this is a global race, if you like that language. We're not the only venture and startup ecosystem and tech ecosystem around the world to realize that the AI is the next frontier. And obviously, a lot of this foundational technology is being built in the US. Surprise, surprise, because it often is. So from the perspective of those big players I mentioned earlier, they're largely they're largely US based. We have companies like Arm, which are now arguably also US based post listing, but we do have some competence at that sort of more foundational layer. But I think the London in particular as a tech ecosystem, although that's now being more distributed throughout the UK, is really promising for AI. And the opportunities we see, I tend to think about it in sort of a few different buckets. And one of those is definitely the exciting, innovative approaches to what can AI do at the frontier. We can have self-driving cars, companies like Wave, who can already drive you around London in a self-driving taxi. I didn't get to go in one. I was ill the other day, but my colleagues did, so I missed out there. But that's I think one of the groups of everyone can picture sort of these amazing sort of quite futuristic capabilities. We've invested in a company that is trying to help diagnose mental health conditions using AI to analyze people's facial responses, their speech tone, the context of their speech. And these are absolutely fascinating and potentially transformative opportunities. But then there's another group of actually much more kind of boring sounding things where if we think about the economic opportunity, that could be really powerful too. So for example, taking workflows in businesses that took weeks and months and crunching them down to hours and days actually has huge transformative potential for our productivity, but also there's opportunities there for startups. And sometimes people say, oh, we get some really kind of boring sounding businesses, and I often say, actually, they're probably the most interesting because they're probably seeing something that no one else has seen and no one else has gone after, and really re-engineering the way that very large companies and large corporates go about their business. And I think we shouldn't forget in the sort of AI hype that they might be some of the most important economic innovations from AI, even if they're not necessarily going to be on the breakfast news in terms of the kind of very innovative, exciting side of it. So I think keeping open-minded about that, but I do think that the UK and London in particular has a great platform on which to build. But all those enabling ingredients need to be right. Otherwise, we've got people snipping at our
Well, and
heels.
speaking of that, I mean, one of the criticisms, I'm going to come to Leonie because she's probably had experience of trying to fund development and so on. But let me just come back to you, Leo, on the culture issue, because the UK investor is often accused of being much more risk averse than the Silicon Valley investor and so on. We've had reports about scale up and all that kind of aspect. So, where our university research is great, the startup culture is very good. But after that, sometimes it looks as though, well, like the DeepMind situation where you get this what looks like a very successful startup, which then is sold off to one of the big tech companies.
Yeah, and that is a kind of long-running debate. I'm personally more of the view that companies, if they want to go on a venture capital sort of financing journey and do that whole thing, which starts with investment like ours and scales on, they're going to at some point either need to become attractive to kind of the very global nature of sort of later stage investment capital, or they're not. I think that I see the argument, but sometimes people say, well, this company got to what's called Series B, which is basically sort of growth stage financing, and there wasn't enough capital in the UK to support it, so it sort of didn't have any option but to be sold or to shut down. And I think there probably are some cases like that. But I think we've invested in a company that's growing, believe it or not, meat or specifically animal fat in a lab in Old Street in London, and that's really an attempt to see if we can produce meat that doesn't require the animal and therefore all the, in particular, emissions and implications and land use that come with livestock farming. Really amazing, really cutting edge science. But actually, they raised some initial money from the UK and Europe, but actually they've raised money from global investors who are specialized in that space and who bring that heft. And so I think on one hand, absolutely, we need more sort of homegrown capital and more scale-up investors willing to take those risks in the UK on UK companies. But I don't think that will ever be sufficient to really put the backing we need behind. If we're going to have UK companies that become globally important and dominant, they're also going to need global capital. So I see it both ways. But I do think, as a final point, you alluded to it, sort of the US culture in particular towards risk taking and failing not necessarily being a terrible thing, but being part of essentially running experiments. I think we could do with a lot more of that kind of cultural mindset here in the UK to destigmatize essentially having tried but failed, as opposed to never having tried at all.
Thank you. Leonie, you've had to get out there and look for investors. What's your experience?
So my experience there is mostly with my previous company, which was in quantum computing. And I have to say that the fact that the UK government put in a quantum strategy extremely early has helped that ecosystem enormously in the UK, right? The UK ecosystem in quantum is pretty much second to none. I mean, yes, the US is bigger, etc., but it's extremely close-knit. Investment opportunities are great. Government as a customer is something that is being thought through. And so I think this is actually a really good example of something working pretty well. I think in AI, as far as I know, this has been a bit less sort of coordinated. It's obviously also a much bigger space than quantum computing, and a bit more organically grown. But I have definitely experienced firsthand how government can make a difference there.
Yes.
Perhaps a message we can give.
Yes, well, procurement is a powerful tool, isn't it? But you're not quite seeing the power of procurement, government procurement, in AI yet, or
I have not seen that working as well in such a coordinated manner, I have to say, yes. I mean, I obviously work in a sector where government has a lot to say, right? Big construction projects. There are various projects we work with at NPlan that, you know, the railway, etc., that have very strong ties to government. And there I have not seen this sort of coordinated effort, I have to say.
Yes, I mean, so you've moved, in a sense, from the world of quantum into the world of AI much more deeply. Just tell us a little bit about your current, products and activities. They're related to construction, essentially.
That's correct. I mean, the construction industry has had a huge problem in the last 50 years in terms of a mega project delay, right? We have a lot of big projects, very ambitious projects, and they are all delayed. 6 out of 7 projects end up being delayed and run over budget. That's a huge problem, and the way NPlan is trying to solve this, or contribute to solving this, is to use machine learning or AI-based forecasting models to forecast based on the input of many previous projects where exactly a new project may get delayed, so you can take action earlier. So it supplements, in a way, traditional sort of risk management on big mega projects to make that easier, more effective, less biased, and give people more foresight to tackle the issues before they really break your neck and make your project delayed.
Fantastic. Well, I won't make any, I'll have to bite my tongue and not mention any government construction projects that have been delayed or cancelled or whatever. But it sounds to me as though that is an extremely positive potential contribution to major infrastructure projects.
That's right.
That's really, really important. So, sorry.
I had to smile a bit when Leo said, "Oh, and then there's these boring companies that try to change a workflow," which is essentially what we're trying to do. And the reason I had to smile was the change management that you have to put in and put on the ground in big enterprises, especially highly regulated ones that have frameworks in place, contractual frameworks in place, is extremely hard. And getting everyone on board with a new technology that is sort of opaque and doesn't tell you why it forecast a certain thing, that is very, very hard. And that's probably the thing we're grappling with as a company most at the moment.
But also, Leo said boring was good.
So, yeah.
You're obviously on exactly the right track here.
Boring in the best possible, boring in the most exciting possible way. And just to jump in on what Leonie said about kind of adoption of AI as opposed to just, I think a lot of the time the founders we meet and talk to and a lot of those that are building products, whether we've invested in them or not, are really just focused on, can we build this piece of tech? Can we get it working really well, its accuracy or its predictive rate? And that is obviously crucial. But the other side of it is someone going to use it? Do they know how to, and will they adopt it? And it's exactly as Annie said, if it's a government or a public body trying to do a project, or a large corporate, you say, we've got a great way of you changing the way you do your financial budgeting or something. Well, of course, at the end of the day, a human somewhere in a room is sitting down, interacting with this thing, onboarding it, getting their colleagues to use it. And that is often where I think kind of cutting edge technology collides with the realities of just corporate inertia and people just sort of having ways of working. And also, frankly, they are not technologists. They are just doing whatever job they happen to be doing. And so I think it's incumbent on the innovators and the founders and their investors and everyone else to bring that to it's not up to the adopters to sort of bring themselves to the technology. I think it's up to the technologists to bring the technology to the adopters and make it make sense, make it understandable, make it feel additive and not scary or risky. So we see that a lot in the companies we back. It might be that the product's fantastic, but there's a whole different ball game of getting it to market.
Yeah, and sorry, this is perhaps also a cultural difference between the US and the UK, specifically that the US tends to be extremely good at taking this anthropological view into consideration and do great design and great kind of product management to anticipate these challenges and to really build for the user so the user can get the value out of the product. That is, I think, a cultural element that we could be much stronger at in the UK.
Yes, and you could argue that our boards in the UK really don't have enough technological understanding. It isn't just a question of kind of risk aversion or whatever for the adopter. It's the fact that they don't really understand the potential to quite a large extent. And it's all somebody else down the chain, the CTO or the CIO who needs to handle all the technology side of things. Whereas actually this is a corporate opportunity quite often, which is not being seized. So we're really onto the bit that talks about not so much the opportunities, but the kind of areas of risk, what we should be worrying about, what the impacts could be. I mean, we've got a whole bunch of issues surrounding deep fakes, for instance, and democracy and pornography and so on, looking at the dark side, so to speak. Do you think, for instance, that we're in the business where actually automation is going to happen very rapidly as a result of the adoption of AI in our businesses, and that's going to create a huge number of job losses? Or are you more sanguine about it? Where do you think we should be placing our kind of our sort of slide rule over the risks, so to speak, to use a very old-fashioned non-AI term? I'll start with you, Leonie.
About will it create or destroy jobs? I am not sure yet. It will definitely change jobs a lot. It will change the workplace a lot, especially generative AI. What we are seeing now is that the potential that these big large language models may have a really profound effect on white-collar jobs, right? On marketing, on software engineering, on these sorts of jobs that we thought were sort of immune against automation. So we definitely will have to adapt. We have to upskill. I think this is a very Liberal Democrat topic, education and lifelong learning. I think this is something that will become increasingly important as the change in technology is accelerating.
Yes, and what about other risks? Just sort of going into the actual application of, we get a lot of hype, and Robin in his introduction talked about polarization. We've had, I think Elon Musk said it was more dangerous than nuclear weapons or whatever. That was some years ago, but I suspect that he would probably say it's pretty much the same nowadays. How risky are we talking here? We talked earlier about the sheer versatility of generative AI, the autonomy, and of course, we've got issues surrounding the copyright of the material ingested by large language models, but our government talks about existential risk rather more than current risks. They tend to be thinking about, what happens when AGI, artificial general intelligence, comes down the track? I mean, where would you put the balance of all this?
Gosh, yeah, I mean, we're going into a huge global election year, right? And much has been written about the question as to how generative AI may or may not be used to influence these elections, for example, through deep fakes, through video generation. And it is quite heartening to see that many of the companies making LLMs have reacted and have put out statements about watermarking their content or about not allowing certain types of images to be created. But we will have to see how any of this scales. And I do think that, the reaction from governments to all of this has been a bit disappointing. It's not been at the forefront of what's actually happening and what's actually possible. There doesn't seem to be that much thought on doing more than just this voluntary, OpenAI will watermark its content, great, but where's the government involvement in all of this? Because I do think it is extremely important to get a grip on this, and we have seen this sort of thing happen before, right? In run up to the 2016 US election. The AI was essentially used to curate content, and not deliberately, but curated our feeds in a way that was extremely harmful.
Are you thinking of the Cambridge Analytica scandal?
That one, exactly. Well, yeah. There was a whole. Well, if we're thinking about how AI has been used, or especially deep learning has been used to curate the things we're seeing, our world that we're seeing online. This has been a topic for a long time, and I don't think it has been adequately addressed by regulation at all, right? We've had the online safety bill, but it's a bit toothless. We've had a couple of things in Europe coming out. They've all been a bit toothless. They don't really look at the fundamental problem we're having with social media. And I mean, if I think about the threats of AI, I generally don't think about AGI coming along. I think about the horror I will have when my currently 2- and 5-year-old daughters will get a smartphone and will get on Instagram or whatever social media platform will be prevalent and cool then.
I'm going to come to you for your prescription in a minute, but first of all, I want to see whether Leo agrees that the risks you've talked about are the risks that you lie awake at night worrying about, Leo.
Well, as a parent, I also definitely worry about the minor 3, 5, and 7, but same deal when it comes to. I think that's just about generally how ready as a society are we to kind of deal with these technological changes when they come. I think we're kind of just about recovering from the smartphone 18 years later. Never mind social media and then never mind AI. So my general concern is that we just despite each time it happens, society, we look back and we go, oh, we probably should have done a bit more thinking for that revolution. We the next one comes along and we don't notice it. So my general point on this is that, and actually this is quite a controversial view within the venture and tech community, is that of course there will be a role for regulation and the right public policy response. There are some in the tech community who I spend quite a lot of my time kind of constructively arguing with, that regulators and policymakers should just get out of the way. We don't need to worry about this stuff. Let the technology, work its way through. Don't constrain it. Then we'll maximize the opportunity and all this kind of stuff. And I just think that's an unrealistic view of how the world works. I think two things can be true at the same time. Yes, there's huge promise from AI in terms of economic and social improvements, but of course there are risks. And I tend to agree, I think, Tim, with your characterization of the technologists most interested in the existential risk that's perceived with, general or AGI and computers sort of taking over the world. That whole, what feels like a sci-fi view, but is credible as a view and a concern. But the short term, and particularly the social implications of AI, I think tend to be, because they're harder, they need immediate answers, or at least the beginnings of answers. I think we tend to sort of maybe shy away from them a little bit. I mean, we've talked about a few of them. The other one, I suppose, is I do sometimes think about this question of sort of the way it will reconfigure economic power. And, we arguably, looking back, I think there's been a consensus that the response to the emergence of big tech, so-called it, from an economics perspective was inadequate. Maybe we're going to have another version of that. And so to add to the social issues that Leonie sort of covered, I think there's some economic and kind of employment issues that are important. And maybe the final point is that this isn't one sort of department or one government's responsibility. This isn't sort of every science department of every government in the world needs to get their heads together. No, it's the Treasury thinking about the future of the welfare state. Is that going to match a society which reconfigures around a different form of employment? It's the transport department saying, well, when we have drones flying themselves around delivering things using AI, what does that mean? It's the health system thinking, how far do we let AI replace clinical judgment? These are critical judgments that need to be made by people who are really highly skilled in the technology and the public policy, taking kind of measured, thoughtful views. And I just think we're probably quite a long way away from that at the moment.
Yeah, having people who combine all those qualities, they're a bit like hen's teeth, I would have thought, in that sense.
It is, but it's. I think that's largely because the worlds of public policy and technology and venture have done a very poor job of talking to one another in the past, and both, I'd say, have made relatively little effort, and so both feel misunderstood, and they're standing quite a long way apart, but neither of them are necessarily making the effort to close the gap. And until that happens, I think we'll still have this sort of sense that the two are somehow metaphysically incompatible, when of course they're both very clever people who've chosen to focus on different things. I think getting them together a bit more is where we need to go, but we still have this sort of, I think, this sort of slightly hostile discussion going on of, well, you want to regulate my technology, and then the technologists want to somehow sort of destroy society because they're so obsessed with AI. And of course, neither are true, but it's a convenient excuse for sort of both camps to get to actually not have to engage with the other, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we have seen actually what I think was a very positive outcome for society in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, right? There was more and more regulation introduced to the financial industry, right? In more transparent ways, with more public involvement. And, obviously mistakes were made. None of this was perfect, but I feel like a lot can be learned and can be applied from that sort of regulatory work to big tech, even on the technical level, because we've started regulating algorithmic trading, right? The FCA is doing a great job at being at the forefront of technology and of what is happening in the financial world, and so we have a blueprint, I think, for what could happen in big tech.
That's really helpful, Leonie. From in terms of unpacking where you sit, I'm going to come to Leo in a minute about whether he would make any kind of regulatory prescription at this moment. But let me ask you, I mean, there's a whole variety of ways you could move on to. I mean, we could talk about competition. That's one of the areas where, the domination of the big cloud services, the big AI, large language models could be seen to be, not encouraging innovation. You could look at the IP, the area of copyright. You could look at the whole area of mandating certain risk management and transparency standards, which, as you mentioned, our government seems to be, entirely happy to do it on a voluntary basis. How far would you go in terms of specific regulation for the kinds of technology we've talked about this morning?
I have a perhaps also controversial opinion about this. So I think it is very difficult to regulate AI on the whole because, well, it's a technology and it is being used in different contexts for different purposes in different industries, right? Healthcare has a pretty good way of regulating other things that are data-driven. They probably have the tools in place to do a pretty good job in AI, and they can tweak what they have. Social media is a complete Wild West. Still, it is where AI is being used to curate our world, essentially. And then there's other applications. So I think we can't just regulate AI as a whole. I think we have to regulate specific sectors of AI. So that's what I definitely
What
believe.
happens where, for instance, AI is not adopted by a regulated sector? Do you think there's no role for a kind of horizontal level of regulation? So you're not a fan of the AI Act in the EU, for instance?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Generally speaking, what happens if? That's a very good question. I don't think I have a good answer to this. I do very much believe that we have to regulate social media better, and that we probably should do it through a kind of an arm's length regulator rather than kind of similar to the FCA in the financial context. I don't think we should mandate AI to be adopted by anyone, really. If there's a regulated industry, we can obviously help with looking at regulation, etc., to make adoption easier.
But not mitigating current risks.
No,
So
I would
you
say
think the risks are mainly in social media, and we do have the Online Safety Act now coming down the track. So you think we don't need to go any further?
I do think we need to go further, absolutely, in social media for sure. And we obviously need to also look at the specific applications of AI in specific sectors. But then I think regulation has to be sector specific.
And so you would deal with deep fakes in that way in an election set of regulations, or whatever it may be. I'm with you. Leo, are you of the same mind?
I think I am in general. So when the UK's approach, and I know people aren't necessarily familiar with every twist and turn, the listeners, but the UK's so far taken a relatively more flexible approach than the EU on AI, and it's said partly let's see, but also that sectoral regulators need to take the first step in deciding what AI means for their sector. And at one level, I think that makes perfect sense because the healthcare regulator deciding whether a clinician can use AI to diagnose an illness has a very different set of questions to ask themselves as to whether the Civil Aviation Authority let a drone fly over London using beyond visual line of sight technology to know where it's going versus something in social media about deep fake. So it might be that the underlying technology allowing those things to happen is somehow similar, but I think the question that those regulators are asking themselves is, what's the impact of this on whoever I'm hoping to sort of protect or keep safe or whatever have you. So, but my concern really isn't so much that about that framing per se, but about how able are those regulators to really drill into the technology and understand it well enough to know, not just now, but in the next 12, 24, 36 months, what this is going to mean. Because I think the one lesson of last year when generative AI, ChatGPT sort of unveiled itself to the world is that these shifts happen very quickly and without much warning. And it's really how capable are regulators, how equipped are they to respond? So actually one of my controversial views is that we need to give all the regulators a lot more money to upskill themselves and hire talented technologists to be able to explain to themselves what this will mean and then make the appropriate response. So whether it's more regulation or just more empowered, capable, and sort of well-informed regulators, I think that's the direction we need to head in. And the £100 million given to the AI Safety Task Force, which was set up last year, is a great case in point. That just took the resourcing question off the table and said, essentially, we don't care how much it costs. We're more interested in the right answer. And I think that mentality and a sort of value for money framing often in government can sometimes get lost.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of questions about regulation and the nature of it and the oversight of our regulators that we could, if we had time, but I see Robin is with us again, that we don't have time to look at. My final question to you, Leo, is you don't think that now we've got the AI Act coming through, probably April in its final form, that an awful lot of developers and adopters are going to be looking to, in a sense, comply with that and all the compliance assessment involved. And really, whatever we do here, it may not be particularly relevant at the end of the day.
It's an important question because obviously, a bit like Leonie talked about financial services regulation and a bit like tax policy, the technology doesn't stop at borders. And so people can move, technology and software can be sold across borders. And in fact, the issue with copyright and whether someone's infringed someone's copyright, that's a problematic one about crossing borders if you train a model in the US and you sell it in the UK. So I think at the very least, Tim, in answer to your question, what the UK does has to make sense in the context of where global regulation is going. I don't think we can sort of exempt ourselves from working out what we think is best for the UK, but obviously that can't be so at odds with other jurisdictions that we sort of isolate the UK into a sort of economic zone where you wouldn't, for example, bother bringing your healthcare product to market because it's so difficult, because we want to benefit from that innovation. And so I think there's a balance, but I actually think something like Leonie described, some kind of supranational view on AI regulation is going to have to emerge, because that's the way we solved financial regulation. It's the way we solved tax policy. It looks to me like we're going in that direction at this stage.
So, Leonie, big nod, convergence of standards internationally, that's what we need to go for.
I would totally agree. And I also agree with Leo's point about upskilling and getting some of that technical talent that currently figures out how to better place ads, right? to really think deeply about how to regulate this industry, how to make it more transparent, how to get a really good discourse going, right, on where we land in terms of what we want to foster and what we want to regulate in a society in terms of AI.
Well, thank you both very much. I know Robin's going to make, I think, a public interest announcement, but I'm going to hand back to him with a big thanks to both of you. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tim. Just a last thought. It's long been said about technology that we tend to vastly overestimate the short-term impact and massively underestimate the long-term impact. And it was said way back about the motor car when that came in. It's certainly been true about the internet, and I'm absolutely sure that's going to be the case about the AI. As I say, we ain't seen nothing yet. But in conclusion, and this is a big topic, and for people who want to know more, we'll post links on the website. But for now, can I just thank you all for your great contributions. Thanks, Leonie. Thanks, Leo. And thanks, Tim. Thank you.